I never expected my daughter's imagination to lead us down such a terrifying path. My name's Rebecca, and I live in a peaceful suburban neighborhood in Northern California with my husband, Tom, and our 6-year-old daughter, Lily. Our story began about 8 months ago, shortly after we moved into our new home. Lily had always been a creative child, full of wonder and fantasy. So when she started talking about her new friend, Max, I didn't think much of it. Imaginary friends are common for kids her age, right? But as the weeks went by, I noticed something off about the way Lily interacted with Max. It started with little things. Lily would leave an extra chair at the dinner table, insisting that Max needed a place to sit. She'd have animated conversations with thin air, laughing and arguing as if someone was really there. I found it endearing at first, even cute. Tom and I would exchange amused glances over Lily's head, silently acknowledging our daughter's vivid imagination. But then things started to change. Lily began waking up in the middle of the night, crying and calling out for Max. When I'd rush to her room, she'd be sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with fear, pointing to the corner of the room. "Max is upset," she'd whisper. "He doesn't like it when I sleep." I tried to reassure her, explaining that Max was just a figment of her imagination, a friend who couldn't harm her. But Lily insisted that Max was as real as you and me. "He's right there, Mommy," she'd say, her voice trembling. "Can't you see him?" Of course, I couldn't. But something about the way Lily looked at that empty corner made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I found myself avoiding that part of her room, feeling an inexplicable chill whenever I passed by. As the weeks went on, Lily's behavior began to change. My once outgoing, cheerful little girl became withdrawn and moody. She'd spend hours in her room, whispering to Max. When I'd try to engage her in other activities, she'd resist, saying Max would be upset if she left him alone. One afternoon, I was folding laundry in Lily's room while she was at school. As I worked, I felt an odd sensation, like someone was watching me. I turned around, half expecting to see Tom standing in the doorway. But there was no one there. Just as I was about to shake off the feeling, I heard a soft thud behind me. Lily's favorite stuffed animal had fallen off the shelf. I walked over to pick it up, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the wall behind the shelf, barely visible unless you were looking for it, were 3 faint scratches. They looked recent, as if someone or something had just brushed against the paint. With my hands shaking, I called Tom at work. He tried to calm me down, suggesting that maybe Lily had done it herself, or that our cat, Ziggy, was to blame. But Ziggy didn't usually scratch in places like that, and the scratching posts were too high for Lily to reach. That night, after we put Lily to bed, Tom and I had a long talk. We decided to take Lily to a child psychologist, thinking that perhaps Max was a manifestation of some underlying anxiety or stress. Dr. Anderson was kind and patient, but after several sessions, she seemed puzzled by Lily's case. Lily's attachment to Max is unusually strong, she explained during one of our parent consultations. While imaginary friends are common, the level of fear and dependency Lily displays is concerning. Has there been any significant stress or change in her life recently? We racked our brains, but couldn't think of anything beyond the move, which Lily had seemed to handle well. As we left Dr. Anderson's office that day, I felt a growing sense of unease. What if this was something beyond normal childhood imagination? Things came to a head about a month ago. I was awakened in the middle of the night by Lily's cries. I raced to her room, finding her huddled in the corner, her body trembling. "Max scared me, Mommy," she whispered, holding out her arm. In the dim light of her nightlight, I could see faint marks on her skin, like the brush of something cold. Tom and I were beside ourselves with worry. We took Lily to the doctor, who examined her and assured us there was no physical harm. But the doctor's concerned questions about Lily's mental state left us feeling unsettled. How could we explain that an imaginary friend was causing this fear in our daughter? In the days that followed, we tried everything we could think of to help Lily. We sagged the house, had a priest come to bless her room, and even considered moving. But nothing seemed to help. Lily continued to insist that Max was real, and that he was upset. We were trying to make him leave. Last week, I was doing dishes when I heard Lily talking in the living room. I assumed she was playing with her toys, but as I listened more closely, I realized she was having a one-sided conversation. "No, Max," I heard her say, her voice uncharacteristically stern. "I won't do that. It's wrong." There was a pause, and then Lily spoke again, this time her voice trembling. "Please don't be upset, Max. I'll be good, I promise." I dropped the plate I was washing, barely noticing as it shattered on the floor. I ran to the living room, my heart pounding. Lily was standing alone in the middle of the room, staring at the empty space in front of her with a mixture of fear and defiance. "Lily," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Who were you talking to? What did Max want you to do?" She turned to me, her eyes filling with tears. "He wanted me to be mean to Ziggy, Mommy. He said if I didn't, he'd be upset with you and Daddy instead." I gathered Lily in my arms, feeling her small body shake with sobs. Over her head, I could have sworn I saw a shadow move in the corner of the room, but when I blinked, it was gone. We're at our wits' end now. Tom and I have discussed sending Lily to stay with her grandparents for a while, hoping that a change of environment might help. But part of me is terrified that Max might follow her, that this, whatever it is, has latched onto our daughter in a way we can't understand or combat. I don't know what to do anymore. I've always considered myself a rational person, but how do you fight something you can't see? How do you protect your child from a threat that shouldn't even exist? All I know is that every night, as I tuck Lily into bed, I find myself whispering a desperate prayer. Please, if anyone's listening, help us. Help my little girl. And every night, as I turn off the light and close Lily's door, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me from the shadows, waiting. If you are enjoying it, please consider subscribing and clicking the like button to support my channel. It began so subtly that I almost didn't notice it at first. Just a feeling, you know, like something was off when I woke up in the morning. I live alone in this old Victorian house that's been converted into apartments. It's a beautiful place, all hardwood floors and high ceilings, but it creaks and groans like you wouldn't believe. At first, I chalked it up to that just an old house settling. But then I started noticing my bedroom door. Every single morning, without fail, it would be slightly ajar. Now, you've got to understand, I'm kind of paranoid about security. Growing up in a rough neighborhood does that to you. So I always lock my bedroom door before I go to sleep. It's just habit at this point. The first few times it happened, I figured I must have forgotten to lock it. We all have those nights where we're so tired, we can barely think straight, right? But as it kept happening, night after night, I started to get a sinking feeling in my stomach. I tried everything. I double-checked the lock before bed. I even put a chair in front of the door one night. But come morning, the door would be open just a crack, the chair pushed aside ever so slightly. I'm not ashamed to admit it, I was scared. The thought of someone or something coming into my room while I slept, it made my skin crawl. I started having trouble falling asleep, lying there in the dark, straining my ears for any sound of movement. One night, About a month into this whole ordeal, I woke up suddenly. The room was pitch black, but I had this overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. You know that feeling when someone's staring at you? It was like that, but 100 times more intense. I lay there, frozen, barely breathing. And then I heard it the softest whisper of movement, like fabric brushing against fabric. It was coming from the foot of my bed. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to turn on the light, to confront whatever was there, but I was paralyzed with fear. I squeezed my eyes shut and started silently praying, begging for morning to come. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through my window. And my door? Wide open. That was my breaking point. I called my landlord that day and demanded he change the locks. He seemed skeptical, but agreed when I threatened to move out. The locksmith came, changed every lock in my apartment, and gave me the only set of keys. That night, I went through my usual routine. Double-checked the locks, pushed a heavy dresser in front of the door for good measure. I even set up my phone to record any movement during the night. Morning came. I woke up, heart racing, and looked at the door. It was closed, still barricaded. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But when I checked my phone, the video showed the door opening, just a crack around AM. The dresser didn't move an inch. I've been staying with friends since then, too scared to spend another night in that apartment. I've talked to previous tenants, and apparently, I'm not the first one to experience this. The landlord says it's just the old house settling, that the door frames aren't quite square anymore. But I know what I saw, what I felt. I never thought much about scarecrows until I inherited my family's farm in Kansas. Growing up, I'd visit my grandparents here during summers, but I'd moved away for college and built a life in the city. When Grandpa passed, leaving the farm to me, I figured I'd sell it. But something made me decide to give farm life a shot, at least for a while. The farm was just as I remembered its sprawling cornfields, the old red barn, and that weather-beaten farmhouse that had seen better days. What I didn't remember was the scarecrow. It stood in the middle of the cornfield, arms outstretched, its burlap face frozen in a crooked smile that sent a chill down my spine. That old thing, your grandpa put it up years ago. Mrs. Henderson, our neighbor, told me when she came by with a welcome-back pie. Said it was the best scarecrow he'd ever had. Never saw a crow in his fields after that. I nodded, not thinking much of it. That first week, I was too busy settling in and figuring out how to run a farm to pay attention to some stuffed guardian of the corn. As I was cleaning out Grandpa's old study, I came across a dusty journal tucked away in the back of his desk drawer. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started reading. Most of it was mundane farm stuff, crop rotations, weather patterns, yield predictions. But then I stumbled upon an entry from the summer of 1954, the year of the Great Drought. July 15, 1954, the crops are dying. Haven't seen rain in months. Banks are calling. Don't know how we'll make it through the year. Met a stranger at the crossroads today. Says he can help. The price. God help me, but I'm desperate. The next entry, dated 2 days later, sent a chill down my spine. July 17, 1954, the scarecrow appeared in the field this morning. Don't know how it got there. Corn's already looking greener. What have I done? I slammed the journal shut, my heart racing. It was just the ramblings of an old man, right? But as I glanced out the window at the scarecrow standing sentinel in the field, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. That night, I woke up to the sound of scratching at my window. Heart pounding, I fumbled for the bedside lamp. The scratching stopped the moment light flooded the room. I peered out the window, half expecting to see the scarecrow's face pressed against the glass. Instead, there was nothing but the dark silhouette of cornstalk swaying in the breeze. The next day, I decided to do some digging. I headed into town and stopped by the local library, asking about the drought of '54. The librarian, an elderly woman named Margaret, looked at me with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Oh, it was a terrible time," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "So many farms went under. Except," she paused, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear, "except your grandfather's. His crops flourished that year and every year after. People talked, you know." "Talked about what?" I asked, leaning in. Margaret hesitated. "There were rumors. About deals made in the dark. About things that ain't natural." I left the library with more questions than answers. As I drove back to the farm, the sky darkened with approaching storm clouds. The wind picked up, making the cornstalk sway and rustle in a way that seemed almost deliberate. That night, as rain lashed against the windows and thunder rolled across the sky, I sat up reading more of Grandpa's journal. The entries after July 1954 were different, filled with accounts of bountiful harvests, but also with growing paranoia. He wrote about movement in the fields at night, about the scarecrow's eyes seeming to follow him. A particularly loud crack of thunder made me jump. As lightning illuminated the room, I caught a glimpse of something outside my window. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing there, straw-stuffed arms raised against the stormy sky. I scrambled to the window, heart pounding. The scarecrow was back on its post in the field, but was it facing a different direction now? Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every gust of wind, every creak of the old house had me on edge. And underneath it all, I could swear I heard something moving out in the corn. The next morning, I called Mrs. Henderson. "Hey, this might sound crazy, but has anyone ever mentioned anything strange about Grandpa's scarecrow?" There was a long pause on the other end. "Why do you ask?" Her voice had lost its usual cheeriness. I hesitated, not wanting to sound like a lunatic. I found Grandpa's old journal. He wrote some weird stuff about it. Mrs. Henderson sighed heavily. "I was hoping you wouldn't find out. Your grandpa, he made a deal years ago, when the drought was bad. Said he met a stranger at the crossroads who promised him good harvests in exchange for. Well, your grandpa never said exactly. But that scarecrow appeared the next day, and the crops flourished ever since." My mouth went dry. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying be careful, Ethan. That scarecrow, it ain't just straw and old clothes. And deals like that, they don't end when the person who made them passes on." That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the cornfield. The moon cast long shadows, and in them, I swear I saw movement. A flicker here, a rustle there. And the scarecrow, it was definitely closer. Its burlap face seemed to grin wider in the moonlight, its eyes two dark hollows that seemed to stare right at me. I blinked, and for a split second, I could have sworn those eyes glowed red. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing. This was insane. Scarecrows don't move. They don't make deals. They're not alive. But as dawn broke, casting long shadows across the cornfield, I knew I couldn't stay. Whatever deal my grandfather had made, whatever was out there in that field, it wasn't natural. And it was getting closer. I packed a bag that morning, my hands shaking as I threw clothes haphazardly into a suitcase. As I loaded up my car, I cast one last glance at the cornfield. The scarecrow was back on its post, arms outstretched, the crooked smile seeming almost triumphant now. I peeled out of the driveway, gravel crunching under my tires. In my rearview mirror, I watched the farm recede into the distance. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road, straw-stuffed arms raised as if in victory. I never went back to that farm. I sold it, sight unseen, to some developer who wanted to turn it into tract housing. Sometimes I wonder if they ever saw what I saw, if they ever felt those empty eyes watching them from the corn. Growing up in a small town in rural Pennsylvania, I always had a fascination with old technology. My grandfather's attic was a treasure trove of gadgets from bygone eras, and I'd spend hours up there tinkering with dusty radios and record players. But there was one night, during the summer of my 15th year, when my innocent hobby took a terrifying turn. It was a sticky July evening, and I was home alone. My parents had gone to a neighbor's barbecue, leaving me to my own devices. Naturally, I headed straight for the attic. As I rummaged through a box of old radio parts, I came across a particularly intriguing piece of shortwave radio from the 1940s. It was heavier than it looked, with a beautiful wooden case and brass dials that gleamed even in the dim attic light. I lugged it downstairs to my room, plugged it in, and began fiddling with the knobs. At first, all I got was static waves of white noise punctuated by the occasional blip of a distant station. But then, as I slowly turned the tuning dial, something caught my ear. It was faint at first, barely audible above the hiss of static, but it grew clearer as I fine-tuned the frequency. It was a man's voice, low and gravelly. The audio quality was poor, full of crackles and pops, but I could make out words. Emergency broadcast, immediate evacuation, unknown entity. My heart began to race. Was this some kind of emergency alert? I leaned in closer, straining to hear. The voice continued, multiple sightings, extreme danger, do not attempt to engage. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. What was this? Some kind of prank broadcast? Suddenly, the signal strengthened, and the voice became crystal clear. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. An unknown entity has breached containment. All citizens within a 50-mile radius of Site 17 must evacuate immediately. Do not attempt to gather belongings. Do not attempt to use motor vehicles. Proceed on foot to the nearest extraction point. Military personnel will guide you. If you encounter the entity, do not engage. Do not look directly at it. Run. May God have mercy on our souls. My mouth went dry. This had to be a joke, right? Some radio drama or War of the Worlds style broadcast. But the fear in the man's voice sounded so real, so raw. I felt my palms grow sweaty as I gripped the radio tighter. The broadcast repeated, over and over. Each time, I felt my anxiety ratcheting up a notch. I tried other frequencies, but they were all dead air or static. When I returned to the original frequency, the broadcast was still going. I don't know how long I sat there, listening to that terrifying message on loop. It could have been minutes or hours. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this real? Was there really some kind of monster or alien on the loose? Should I call someone? Try to evacuate? A car door slammed outside, snapping me out of my panic trance. I heard my parents' voices laughing as they came up the driveway. Relief washed over me. Everything was normal. The world wasn't ending. With shaking hands, I reached to turn off the radio. But before I could, the broadcast suddenly cut out mid-sentence. For a moment, there was only static. Then, a new voice came through, a woman's voice, calm and professional. "This concludes our test of the emergency broadcast system." This was only a test. Had this been an actual emergency, I slumped back in my chair, my heart still pounding. It was just a test. A routine test of the emergency system. But as I sat there in the dark, trying to slow my breathing, a chill ran down my spine. Because I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd heard wasn't a test at all. That somewhere out there, something had happened. Something real. Something terrifying. I never told anyone about that night. Who would believe me? But to this day, I can't help but wonder, what if it wasn't just a test? What if, for a brief moment, I had tuned into something I was never meant to hear? The thought keeps me up at night sometimes, ears straining in the darkness, listening for a broadcast that I hope will never come again. My friends and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We chose a remote spot in the Ozarks, far from the usual campgrounds. We wanted to really immerse ourselves in nature, you know? There were 4 of us, me, my best friend Kayla, her boyfriend Jake, and our mutual friend Alex. We'd all grown up together in a small town in Missouri, and this was our last hurrah before Kayla and Jake moved away for grad school. We arrived at the campsite late Friday afternoon. The sun was already starting to set as we pitched our tents and got a fire going. The forest around us was thick and dark, but the crackling fire and the sound of our laughter made it feel cozy rather than intimidating. As night fell, we roasted marshmallows and shared stories. The stars were incredible out there, away from the city lights. I remember thinking how peaceful it all was. It must have been around midnight when Alex first noticed it. He suddenly went quiet mid-sentence, his eyes fixed on something behind me. "Guys, do you see that?" he whispered. We all turned to look. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, just at the edge of the firelight, I caught a glimpse of something moving. It looked like a small, pale blue light, about the size of a firefly, but brighter and more purposeful somehow. "It's probably just a firefly," Jake said, but he didn't sound convinced. We watched as the light seemed to bob and weave between the trees, sometimes disappearing entirely before reappearing a little closer. Then, as if responding to our attention, more lights appeared. 2, then 5, then a dozen. "Okay, those are definitely not fireflies," Kayla muttered, her voice tight with tension. The lights were moving in a way that seemed almost intelligent. They would come close to our campsite, then retreat, almost as if they were trying to lure us into the forest. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "Maybe we should go inside the tents," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. But before anyone could respond, the light suddenly rushed toward us. In a panic, we scattered. I found myself running into the woods, heart pounding, with only the dim light of my phone to guide me. I could hear the others crashing through the underbrush nearby, but in the darkness, it was impossible to tell which direction the sounds were coming from. The strange lights were all around us now, leading us deeper into the forest. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I stumbled into a small clearing. The others were there too, all of us out of breath and disoriented. "What the hell are those things?" Jake panted, his eyes wide with fear. Before anyone could answer, the lights suddenly converged in the center of the clearing. They swirled together, growing brighter and brighter until we had to shield our eyes. When the light faded, my blood ran cold. Standing in the center of the clearing was a figure. It was tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was pale and seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. But its face, God, its face. It was featureless, just a smooth, blank expanse where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. We stood frozen in terror as the figure slowly turned its head, seeming to look at each of us in turn. Then, without warning, it let out a sound not quite a scream, not quite a whistle, but something in between that made my ears ring and my stomach churn. In that moment of disorientation, the figure vanished, along with all the lights. We were left in total darkness, the silence broken only by our panicked breathing. I don't remember much about how we got back to our campsite. We stumbled through the woods, clinging to each other, jumping at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. When we finally saw the dim glow of our dying campfire, we nearly cried with relief. We didn't sleep that night. We huddled together by the fire, jumping at every sound, until the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees. As soon as it was light enough, we packed up our things and got the hell out of there. We've tried to rationalize what happened that night. Maybe it was some kind of shared hallucination, brought on by something we ate or drank. Maybe it was an elaborate prank by some locals. But deep down, I know what we saw was real. I've done some research since then, and I've found stories of similar experiences in those woods going back decades. Lights that lure people off the paths, strange figures glimpsed between the trees. Some people who go into those woods never come out. I don't know what that thing in the clearing was, or what it wanted from us. But I do know that I'll never set foot in those woods again. And every time I see a light in the darkness now, even if it's just a firefly. Thank you for listening. Now try to sleep.